And welcome back. Now, during his address to the nation last night, President Cyril Ramaphosa said that the festive season poses an immense threat to the lives of South Africans as well as the economy. And that's because large numbers of people are simply ignoring social distancing and other measures, which has ultimately led to the second wave of infections. Now, the president said that the daily average of COVID-19 deaths has increased by nearly 50%, and South Africans now have to adhere to a curfew from 11 p.m. until 4 a.m. Beaches and public parks in the Eastern Cape and the Garden Route district in the Western Cape will be closed to the public from tomorrow until the 3rd of January 2021. And beaches and public parks in KwaZulu-Natal will also be closed on days that are traditionally the busiest during the festive season. Joining us now to discuss this is political analyst Ongama Mtimka. Thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live once more, Ongama.
Morning, Sakina and Leanne. Thank you for having me this morning.
Now, Ongama, the president said that government needed to find a balance between livelihoods and saving lives. Do you think that he has gone far enough? What do you make? What's your overall assessment of the stringency of those restrictions that he spoke about last night?
Sure. So managing a pandemic is more than just a public health crisis. It's political, economic, and social, in the sense that from a political point of view, we're watching the extent to which state-society relations are changing. What does the state feel at liberty to impose, and what's the society's response to that? From an economic point of view, it's about the extent to which the state feels it can make policy that affects economic activity, and the extent to which the business class lobbies for that. And then lastly, from a society point of view, again, goes back to closely related to both the politics and the economy, in the sense that people are concerned about to what extent do their liberties affect their social lives and their ability to earn a living, while at the same time remaining alive to enjoy that money. So it's been a tight balancing act so far. And I think that the president's consultative approach has been both rewarding and sometimes limiting on what he can do. So, for example, when you see stakeholders being able to get a policy directive that is kind of balancing their interests with the need to protect livelihoods. That's been good, but also there's been times where you feel that the president took a decision which was questionable on the basis that the lobby from whatever the affected region was maybe was too strong, or the assumptions made about the risks are a little bit weak. So I'm talking about Cape Town, for example, the difference in policy between the Eastern Cape, KZN, and Cape Town in the latter example.
Now, Ongama, you're on record saying that these measures are actually, they might mimic restrictions on democracy. So can you just expand on that for us, please, in terms of how so? Because during the previous harder lockdown levels, we saw people actually questioning and taking government to court over some of these restrictions.
Sure. So what happens, Sakin, is that in an authoritarian state, the state dictates what needs to happen, and society just obliges. What we saw was quite interesting during times of a crisis, and I think that we're revising our theory about state-society relations and the extent to which society is able to take infringements on their rights. And it looks like times of crisis where initially there's consensus about what are the imminent risks, there tends to be a lot more leeway given to the state to take a directive. So, for example, even now, people are crying that the restrictions which government has imposed are not firm enough. But what we've seen with the first phase of lockdowns is that that consensus gradually weakens as people become used to the increased numbers and in fact learn to live with the pandemic. So now it's not surprising that the response from society, whether you're looking at social media, is that there should have been more restrictions. But as we saw with the previous lockdowns, as time goes, immediately that consensus quickly dissipates. So I think the president would have borne that in mind too, that while there may be cries for firmer restrictions currently, within a matter of weeks, people will be changing that. So it's and claiming and more emphatic about their freedoms and their democratic rights. So it's important to balance between the two, because also you don't want to be a state that keeps changing policy, and because that can convey the wrong message that interest groups in society can get their will if they shout long enough and hard enough.
Ongama, President Ramaphosa also highlighting this issue of social gatherings, of parties that are key contributors to the spread of COVID-19. So what's your view on this? And also perhaps reflecting on government's inability to police situations?
Sure. And in fact, my answer, Sakina, relates to both your question, but also about the potential success of these current restrictions. The ability to police has been a big problem. And in fact, it's not unique to the response to COVID-19. It's a general problem that municipalities face in the country, whether it be concerning illegal dumping or anything else. So we already know that we've got limited capacity. Now, I think it may be time for the state to think about how to augment the law enforcement service, use leveraging on structures that have been created in society. So, for example, police forums have been created, and also neighborhood watches have been created. I think it may be time for the state to kind of try and see how they can leverage on that, especially given the fact that some funds have been stuck, meant for relief because they are not accessible to a wider number of people. Those funds could be redirected to leverage on the numbers that street committees or police forums have already been there. So all the state may need to do is to partially formalize those and get the armies of people that protect their neighborhoods anyway to help augment law enforcement. They've tried it with bringing in the army, and we saw that may have worked in terms of getting people fearful, but the confrontation, it tended to attract confrontation. So it may be time to explore a different strategy of using or leveraging what already exists in terms of enforcement, so that these people who are based in communities are able to quickly report instances of breaking, the law in terms of these restrictions, and some swift action would be needed at the level of senior management in law enforcement, both at the Metro Police as well as the South African Police Service, so that there's a good reinforcement between members of the community based in communities, police forums and neighborhood watches, and responses from law enforcement, because you also don't want to create vigilantism with these social groups that can help reinforce enforcement at the level of society.
And then a few things I still want to touch on as we run out of time. Firstly, the stimulus packages and an update with regard to how well those have worked or perhaps not. Do you feel that perhaps the president should have touched on that, Ongama? And also the question of vaccines, and the president stating that in the initial vaccine rollout, 10% of the population, would probably have access to that in the early parts of next year. Your views on that?
Absolutely, Sakina. And one would have loved to hear, now that the funding instruments created to provide relief, especially to businesses, have failed to get the right traction, there should be a change of strategy. You see, there's a problem with South African funding environment in general, because it operates in the terms of developed country or first world status. It's good that our financial services are first world, but when it comes to creating opportunities to fund businesses, that remains stuck because the frameworks that are being used are too risk averse. And what that does is that it precludes people who are doing great work on the ground in running businesses from providing the safety net, which, by the way, if you look at what's happened in the US, the shift has been that small businesses contribute a significant portion in terms of their share of who employs people the most. So in South Africa, what inhibits it is the fact that the business funding environment is just hostile, if you like, or too risk averse. So one would have wanted to hear what the update and change in strategy is going to be. Because whether it's in the banks or it's in the state development finance agencies, the funding culture is the same. And then, as you were pointing out, people have lost their livelihoods over this. The vaccine message wasn't really that clear or that confidence inspiring as far as I'm concerned, especially with debates being raised about who among the prospective developers of vaccines is getting support, and are there any in South Africa that could, in fact, help respond to the problem, but they too much focus on the international messianic role of Big Pharma, is precluding that focus. So that's important. It's a national debate that needs to be had too.
And we have literally 30 seconds, Ongama. Cape Town, and people questioning why Cape Town beaches have perhaps not seen the same sort of restrictions imposed elsewhere. What's your take on that?
It seems to be that whatever the province was lobbying for is what they got. And I think that if the president took and made an assumption of risk, especially in the big days, they should have had policy directives which are slightly different from what Cape Town was requiring, because those beaches get full all the way, by the way, up to the first week of January.
Well, we'll leave it there for this morning. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. Political analyst Ongama Mtimka talking to us about government's decision to implement certain restrictions over the festive season. And that, of course, speaks to our question of the day as well, where we're asking for your view on these particular restrictions that were announced last night. What is your reaction to those new restrictions announced by President Ramaphosa at last night's family meeting? At Morning Live, SABC, we'll share your responses later in the show. With that, let's take a quick break.